Hello, and welcome to the Fiction Nonfiction podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Jennifer Maritza McCauley, author of Neon Steel.
And I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant. So, Jennifer, do you have one of those little stars on your driver's license? You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah, a star. Okay. So do you mean like the real ID?
Yeah, this thing that I avoided getting for a very long time. But if you don't have it, you gotta pay money to the TSA to get on the plane. Yeah. Do you have that?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, and I'm at AWP in Baltimore right now, and I flew here from Kansas City, where we both are living. So yes, I've got my real ID, but I wasn't all that thrilled about getting it.
I felt like I'd lived my whole life with my driver's license being just fine as it was for me to get on planes. I don't really understand why that became necessary. And actually, Missouri weirdly was against it for a long time. They were one of the last states to adopt it because at one time the Republican Party used to be against government surveillance. Now it seems to have flipped the other way. But it feels like the whole thing is like this increasing focus on who documenting who is and is not a citizen. It's become an obsession. Of the country and particularly this current administration. It makes it harder, and also it makes it harder for certain kinds of people to be citizens, I think, is the main goal.
Or completely redefining what it even means to be a citizen. I mean, we have an ongoing Supreme Court case challenging birthright citizenship as enshrined in the 14th Amendment.
And that's why we've asked Daisy Hernández to join us today to talk about the ideas and myths surrounding citizenship. Daisy is the author of The Kissing Bug, a true story of a family, an insect, and a nation's neglect of a deadly disease, which won the 2022 Penn Genestein Book Award and was selected as an inaugural title for the National Book Foundation's Science and Literature program. She's also the author of the award-winning memoir, A Cup of Water Under My Bed, co-editor of 2 editions of the classic feminist anthology Colonize This, Young Women of Color on Today's Feminism, and a regular contributor to Tricycle, the Buddhist Review. But she's here today to talk to us about her new book, Citizenship, Notes of an American Myth. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So early in your book, you list the important laws governing citizenship and immigration in the U.S. history, from the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 to the Hart-Celler Act of 1965. Could you go through those laws for our listeners and talk about the role they played in changing our definition of citizenship?
Yeah, I was actually really surprised by how much citizenship has changed in the United States. Like a lot of people, I thought it was a much more static and consistent thing that we had. But not only with those laws, but starting as early as 1790, Congress said that you could not naturalize as a U.S. citizen unless you were a free white immigrant at the time. And then, yes, less than 100 years later, around 100 years later, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which actually that began a little earlier with another law, the Page Act, that specifically targeted women from China. So that was a federal regulation, the kind of first federal regulation. I'll start do that again. 3, 2, 1. The first federal regulation around immigration actually had to do with Chinese women, the Page Act, before the Chinese Exclusion Act. But yes, the Chinese Exclusion Act eventually led to the exclusion of most people from Asian countries, with the exception of a few categories. Something that most people don't know about is that in the early 20th century, a woman could lose her citizenship if she married a foreigner. When that law was revised, it was basically said to be, oh, yes, you can marry foreigners unless they're from Asia, basically. So that exclusion continued for a little while longer. The deportations of Mexicans in the 1930s was another huge change in terms of what citizenship means. About a million Mexicans were deported during that time period. More than half of them were Mexican. And the Chinese Exclusion Act, ended sort of in parts. It doesn't really end until 1965, when all the racial and racist quotas are lifted in terms of who can come into the United States. And usually that Hart-Celler Law of 1965 is thought about as the family reunification law. But it was also the legislation that for the first time in history put numerical limits on how many people could come to the United States from Latin America. So even though there had been all sorts of border enforcement. Beforehand, this is the first time that we have the government saying, okay, only 120,000 people can come from the region. Then that gets changed to 20,000 for each country. And it might have worked, except that many more people were coming just from Mexico alone during those years. And I could go on, but my
Well, I
father was
really love.
able
I
to
mean, that
come
whole
into.
background in the book of that you're talking about is really important and contained a lot of information I certainly wasn't aware of. Um, Trump administration is aware of it. I mean, I feel like it's the 1965 Act that really angers people like Stephen Miller, right? I mean, that's what I feel like the Trump administration's current immigration policy is trying in some ways to reverse that act. They didn't like it.
Absolutely. They did not like the racial demographic changes that happened in the United States, where you go from in 1960, Latin American and Asian Americans being a very small number, relatively speaking, in the United States, to then, those immigration numbers have completely flipped by the 1990s, where you have, most people coming from Latin America and from all parts of Asia.
So you point out in the book that I think you were looking at like Library of Congress numbers, if I'm remembering correctly, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. That like the number of books and articles that reference the word citizenship like takes this start to skyrocket in the 1990s. And you go through this interesting thought experiment of like trying to figure out why that would have happened. And I think you have some answers, but you also like talk a lot about a lot of different possibilities. I wonder if you just sort of go through that speculation for our listeners and what you were thinking about when you discovered that.
Yeah, I feel like I should tell your readers that I discovered it because I was procrastinating on my writing. So I was like,
That's
see
how
how
most
many
good
books the
discoveries
Library of
happen.
Congress
That might be how this
has.
podcast got started.
So yeah, I mean, one of the possible reasons is that in the wake of World War II, we literally end up with more citizens. The United Nations, just grows exponentially in terms of the number of countries with decolonization. Another possibility that many people point to is simply globalization, that as we get into the 1990s, we literally have companies and people moving across borders in very unprecedented ways. And then the third reason, of course, is the 21st century and the attacks on 9/11 and the rise of the Department of Homeland Security in the wake of that. And, just surging interest in what it means to belong in so many different ways to a community, to a country, to one another. So a lot of the word citizenship really gets stretched to include just a lot of different experiences as I write, from technological citizens to biological citizens to fetal citizens. I mean, the word really gets stretched in ways that we hadn't seen before the 90s.
So that's really great. So you quote the scholar Dmitry Kochanov, who says that citizenship has simply become a proxy for race. He tells you once you decolonize, you don't need to be racist anymore because the majority of those whom you don't want to see because of their race acquire a different citizenship. So for you, is that what's happening behind everything with Stephen Miller and the Trump administration, and what they're doing when it comes to citizenship?
I absolutely think that it's what's happening, but not only with the Trump administration. This has been underway for decades, where citizenship has become this proxy for race. And it's not only government officials, right? Your neighbor Bob can now go to the city council meeting and say, "I'm not racist. I just don't want these people from that country to be here. Or, I want people who have documents to be here, et cetera, et cetera." So, and it's not only this law professor, but there's an incredible law professor at UCLA, Professor Achume, who has written a lot, pretty extensively, from a legal perspective around what it means what is the citizenship of people whose lives in their countries have been so deeply shaped by the politics of an imperial power. So if we think about just the incredible influence that the United States, both through private companies and foreign policy, has had on, let's just say, El Salvador, then aren't the people who live in El Salvador already members of a larger political community that we think of as the United States? So part of what I write in the book is that when people arrive at the U.S. Mexico border, they're not actually foreigners. They already know our country and our political life very deeply from being so influenced by those US companies and that foreign policy. And of course, right now, what's happening under Trump is just very escalated. So, him taking out, the leader of Venezuela, threatening, Colombia and Cuba and other countries is simply an extension of that.
You do go through a list of the number of places. What do you call it? Something like a different kind of Vietnam War. I'm forgetting the phrase exactly.
The other Vietnam,
Yeah, the
yeah.
other Vietnam War, of the number of Central American and Latin American wars or proxy wars or involvement that America engaged in the what 80s and 90s. Are you think
70s and 80s, yeah.
what's the full list? I remember it's Guatemala, it's Nicaragua, it's El
Yeah,
Salvador. What am I leaving off?
Like, who did you just say? Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, really deeply involved in yes, in these conflicts in that region. Training people, training soldiers and militia through the infamous School of the Americas. These were military people who then went on to massacre their own people in their countries. Of course, most famously in the 1980s, sending illegal weapons into Central America. That was Ronald Reagan's administration. So I call it the other Vietnam because for me, I was a child in the 1980s. So every night on the Spanish language news, that's what I was hearing was the number of dead that day in Guatemala or El Salvador. So to me, it looked like, large scale wars were happening. But they weren't being shown on the English language TV channels during those years.
And that's what you're talking about when you talk about expanding this concept of citizenship. In other words, that these people who were affected by our government, when they show up in our country because their countries have been destabilized, right? And like, where did you come from? Well, actually, they're acting out an act of a political kind of citizenship, right? We're here because of what happened with your country.
Absolutely. As I write in the book, that post colonial axiom of we are here because you were there. And all of Central America is just such an incredibly vivid example.
We are a political podcast, so we wanted to talk to you about the politics of citizenship since it's so current right now. And I'm just going to predict that we have a bunch of Iranians in this country in about, another 3 or 4 years. But I want to. Part of your book is also really personal, and it's in a memoir sort of way, and it's filled with stories about how your mother and father and other members of your family got citizenship in the United States, and how the concept of citizenship affected your lives. You said that you began recording your mother's stories about citizenship when you were 6. I wonder if you could just, first of all, you tell us those stories, but also what were you doing? Where did you get a recording device when you were 6 to record your mom? And did you get her permission? How did this all go? Did
Yes,
she have stuff that was off the record?
I was speaking figuratively.
Oh, okay. All right, good.
Yes,
I was
yes, but I
imagining you with
appreciate the
one of
literal
those little tape
interpretation.
recorders.
No, no, no. But as all 6-year-olds, do have a very photographic memory, or not all, but many 6-year-olds remember very intensely. And also, these were my bedtime stories. So other people other children were getting stories about fairy tales or whatnot, and I was getting to hear her immigration story, why she had come here, what the changes had been like. She actually had not wanted to come, but for financial situations, it seemed like it was a wise decision to come. And then, it's a very common story, right? I can't tell you as a journalist over the years how many people I've interviewed, women particularly, who were not expecting to stay, were just simply expecting to maybe have some opportunities for a short time and go back, and then they get married, there's a family, and then there's a whole new life. But yeah, I'll read from this section that speaks to that experience. I spent my childhood falling asleep night after night, not to tales of wizards and dragons, but to stories about borders and citizenships. I learned that citizenship was a fiction. I could not grab it with my hands like my mother's sewing needles or the chalk she used to mark fabric. Citizenship was a story, an invention, a social construct. In the United States, white men created this fiction of citizenship and used it to organize our lives. to determine when and how and under what circumstances my mother and I could live on this land. The white men issued papers, birth certificates, alien numbers, deportation orders. The white men insisted the fiction was a fact rather than a political and legal and social system they had devised. My mother told me the truth. Citizenship was a story the white men wrote so they could have what they wanted. Historians told me the rest. The white men, free of the British Empire, created a citizenship to produce a country and a political institution that belonged exclusively to them. They massacred non-citizens, they enslaved non-citizens, they declared in 1790 that citizenship was only for white immigrants. When the story began to fall apart in the 1800s, when the Civil War barreled into kitchens and town squares, the white men revised the story. Citizenship would be a prize bestowed on Black people in 1868, on Indigenous people in 1924, and on everyone else when the white man deemed fit. Citizenship became a marker of how free this country was, of how far it had come, of how much it had grown. Even as Black and Indigenous and Mexican and queer activists battled on the streets and in the courts during the 20th century for the most basic of human rights. Citizenship is now a proxy for race. Politicians and political commentators and aunties and coworkers and the guy at the city council meeting can profess to not be racist. They don't care about the color of anyone's skin. It's just that too many non-citizens have arrived at the southern border, at the edge of town, and in the local schools. They want these people to go back home to their own countries, to the places where they were born, where they have papeles. When protests erupted in 2017 over the U.S. ban on the entry of Muslims from 7 countries, Trump's White House circumvented the courts by asserting that the policy had nothing to do with discrimination based on race or religion. It was a matter of national security, which is another way of saying we don't want people with that citizenship. And the arguments for eliminating birthright citizenship, no one has to mention the disproportionate racial impact on brown and Black children from Latin America, Haiti, and China. It's not about their race, the argument goes. It's about what papers their parents have. All of this means that citizenship is a social construct in much the same way that race and gender are. And the value of pulling back the curtain, of saying this is a social construct, is that we can better see the facts. We can see that the social construct of citizenship, like race and gender, governs the contours of our days. It dictates whether or not we call the police, whether or not we drive alone after dark, whether or not we worry about our mothers when they board the public bus. It is easy to forget that race is a social construct when the story favors you, and you do not expect the security guard to follow you around the store. Likewise, when you have citizenship, when the story favors you, you do not worry about your parents driving from Los Angeles to Iowa to visit you at college. You do not think of border checkpoints. You do not pay attention when a woman says the public library issues cards to residents regardless of where they were born.
Incredible. Yeah, that was really wonderful. So thank you. So you also talk about your Uncle Jose's story. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, my uncle was my favorite uncle. He was from Peru. He married my mom's sister, and I adored him for many reasons, including the fact that he was the only person in our family who had a car, and so he could take us places. He could take us to the mall. He could take us to parties out in Long Island. Otherwise, we were always on a public bus. And he was also just incredibly smart and kind and generous. And he was also, he had a green card, but which I found one day in his wallet by, looking through his wallet, found this card that had his picture and identified him as a resident alien, which was really shocking to me at the time. I didn't even really, I didn't understand fully what that status meant. But within my own family, no one really spoke of his status, and in fact, even his wife, my auntie, did not talk about it with her sisters, let alone with me as a child. And so part of the way that we found out what his status was is that, or in 1986, when the country was passing, Congress was passing legislation that would give a legal pathway to citizenship for eventually 3 million people. Um, there was an incredible radio show that every Saturday morning had an immigration lawyer. So you could call in with your questions about your case in particular, and this lawyer would ask you questions and give you, advice and so forth. And one day, while my mother and my auntie were just doing the Saturday morning cleaning of the house, mopping, etc., they heard my uncle on the radio calling in with his situation. And his situation was that he had actually married a Puerto Rican woman for his green card. She had basically abandoned, he had no way, she had left. He had no way of, I'll just start that again. Three, two, one. My uncle had married a Puerto Rican woman for a green card, but she had basically left town. He didn't have any way of knowing where she was. And he was trying to figure out what to do next and whether it would make sense for him to apply now for a visa and the whole process with the new, the 1986 immigration law. And that came just as incredible news to my mother and to my auntie and started a bit of a conversation between them and their sister at that point.
Hmm. Okay.
I was working in Colorado that year in the summer, and two of the I was working on a ranch, and two of the ranch hands I was working with were from Mexico, and so their status changed. I think it was like that summer because they were suddenly like, "Hey, we're going to go to Juarez," where they hadn't been in a really long time, and we drove down there for a weekend, and they were able to come back. It was just kind of amazing,
Um,
like that. Their ability to move through the country had changed overnight. Um, you also write about the healthcare system and how it relates to citizenship and immigration. And you'll hear all the time politicians, usually right wing politicians, making the claim that all immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, are allowed medical benefits. They're stealing our healthcare, which is actually what the Republicans are doing by not funding it and taking money away from real citizens. This isn't true. And yet, and exclusion from healthcare has real world, consequences for people. Could you talk about this connection between citizenship and healthcare and how it came about, what its history is, and how it affected you?
Yeah, I think you can actually really see the history going back to Ronald Reagan and his obsession with the so-called welfare queen and this just relentless attacks on people who needed the safety net. And part of the way that he attacked people was by essentially, identifying them as I write in the book, the anti-citizen, right? The anti-citizen actually needs assistance from the government with healthcare, with housing, with so much. And so you see that in the 1980s. Then by the time that you get to 1996, we have the big what's called colloquially called the welfare reform law that year in 1996. And that's the first time that we see Congress put limitations on how people with a green card can access healthcare in this country. Before, there's a legal scholar who points out, and it's the title of his book, that people with green cards used to be considered citizens in waiting. But by the time we get to 1996, you're really seeing a very different concept proposed where they are no longer in waiting. They are not now non-citizens, and that distinction is more important. There's citizens and non-citizens. And so basically in 1996, the federal government says you can't access federal Medicaid dollars with a green card unless you've been in the country for a full 5 years. What's happened since 1996 is that now the state in which you live can really determine your healthcare access. And so part of what I say in the book is that we are not citizens of one country as much as we are citizens of the state in which we live. And so if you live in Illinois, the state might be using its own Medicaid dollars to help you with a green card be able to see a doctor or access medical care. Tennessee, not true, or other, states, Florida, not necessarily true. And there is a lot of confusion, including as I was working on this book with people in my own life who were like, wait, but someone who's undocumented can always go to the emergency room. Yes, they can. Anyone can go to an emergency room at a hospital. But at that point, the medical staff has to determine if you are having a life and death emergency. And so, an example of this is if you have kidney failure and you need to be on dialysis, that is a chronic condition. So, when you arrive in that ER, they have to determine, right, if this is life or death. Is chemotherapy a life or death situation? Do you need to get emergency chemotherapy? So, you can see that. Doctors and nurses and medical staff are just put in some really impossible situations. And to the point that doctors, there was an incredible doctor in Colorado who led a study looking at, okay, well, what happens to people when they have to rely essentially on emergency dialysis instead of actually being given that care on an ongoing basis? And obviously, the percentages, of deaths, the number of deaths is much higher when they have to rely on an emergency room because they will be turned away as well.
Well, not only that, but speaking just crassly in terms of money, it is more expensive to like run your healthcare system by waiting until people get to the emergency room because all those costs then go to the hospitals, and the hospitals in general in America are struggling, particularly in rural areas, because they
Absolutely.
have to they have to bear this burden.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I always try to remind people too that everything that happens to immigrant communities is so connected to people who are not part of immigrant communities. And healthcare is a really good example because if you have something like, right now going after people on H-1B visas, who are oftentimes some of them are here, for medical reasons. They are doctors or nurses or working in the medical field. Now, if they are gone, you have fewer and fewer people who are available to you, the quote unquote citizen, in terms of getting the care that you need. So we are all very interconnected, which this administration, as well as previous ones, would like us to think that we are more separate than we actually are.
So one thing I was thinking about too is that, Ta-Nehisi Coates talks a little bit about the American dream being a myth and potentially dangerous. And I think that you kind of address many of those things in your book. So I was wondering how you feel about the American dream as a concept.
I also think the American dream is a myth, and
Yeah.
and a dangerous one is that it's always, as you alluded, it's always being held out as something for you to reach for that's actually not viable. That also creates divisions among people and this kind of scarcity of I have to get mine. And there's actually nothing at the end of the day to get because we know that generational wealth, just to take one example, makes a huge difference in terms of what your life outcomes will be like. But also the community that you live in. I mean, there's so much that goes into whether you are going to have an opportunity to simply have a college education. And obviously, that's a huge deal for young people right now who are undocumented and don't necessarily have access to be able to just simply go to college or are in college. This has happened here where I teach. Where they're in college and then they're very anxious about graduating because they're not going to be able to qualify for jobs. They're qualified, but they won't qualify simply because of their citizenship status. So, what does the American dream mean to an 18-year-old who has, a degree from a very private university, a elite university, and yet can't actually do the work that they were trained to do?
Oh, that's a great answer. I mean, all these are great answers. Um, so, yeah, so the chapter on your father, who is from Cuba, is titled The White Man Who Loved Me. Could you talk about his attitude toward race and citizenship and how that affects yours?
Yeah, this was probably the hardest chapter to write in a personal way because I write very openly about my father being a racist, being anti-Black, and the confusion that I experienced growing up because I saw anyone who was Latino or Latina or Latina as like being part of our community. It was like, in my mind, you were Latina first, and then everything else came after. But for my father, it was the opposite. And so I write about, a really heartbreaking moment where I had a love interest in high school, teenage romance and love. And I saw him, this young boy, as being Dominican. I'm Cuban Colombian, he's Dominican. That's how it went in my mind. I was very concerned because we didn't go to the same high school. So I didn't know how much we would have in common after a certain point. And my father saw him as being a young Black teenager, and was like verbally violent with him, kicked him out of our home. And this young person, when he called me later, what he was really so upset with, was almost not the verbal abuse, but that my father had identified him as being Black. The level of internalized racism was, just so intense for all of us. But it really, that has always really stayed with me. And so that particular essay was sorting through, yeah, what racial categories mean for Latinx folks in the United States. And it comes up every 10 years very forcefully in terms of the census. So I also write about the first Trump administration's efforts to include the citizenship question on the census as a way to basically diminish the number of Latinx that would be included just in the census count altogether. And hopefully, the idea was that it would lead to more electoral power for them. But it's a large, huge question, just the racism that we haven't acknowledged within our own diaspora. So with me kind of sorting through that and my own, racial ambiguity, I've been people think I'm all sorts of different ethnicities and even races. So kind of sorting through that myself.
Mm.
We wanted to talk to you a little bit also just about the craft parts of how this book was put together, the writing part of it. Jennifer is at AWP doing the hard work for all of us of representing UMKC at our and talking to writers while I'm here lying and napping in my bed. But this book is very interesting. Like structurally, you have this mixture of like very personal anecdotes. Then you can shift into like suddenly you're talking about someone from the 1700s or the 1800s, or you're talking about federal law, and so you're moving in between this like sort of narrow focus like way of talking about your specific life, and then a much broader like lens, And I wondered how you came, if the book was always structured that way, how you decided you were going to do that way. Like what was your original conception of how this book came together? Because sometimes I don't start doing what I think I end up doing, I don't know if you started with that idea or if it matured during the time of your writing.
Yeah, I definitely began with that idea. And for me, I've always been deeply, deeply inspired by the works of James Baldwin and Audre Lorde. And I feel like they are also two people who I'm thinking of Sister Outsider in particular, Audre Lorde's essays, and James Baldwin, all his essays. And I often teach his work. But they both, I feel like they are such masters, mistresses of moving from the very personal, the very intimate, to that larger political and historical context that they were living through or reflecting on. And so it feels pretty intuitive. Sometimes the big question for me is, will readers follow me when I'm making these associative leaps? So I did want this book to reach a very broad audience. So I'm not very experimental. Like I think sometimes I make it really clear we are now shifting, as you said, to the 1700s. Here's how we're doing it. So I do think I provided a lot more connective tissue than I would have if I wanted a more experimental work. And this is something that I talk about a lot with my students. I teach in both an MFA program and an undergrad creative writing program. That's a decision you're going to have to make: is how much work you want your readers to do with your book or with your standalone essay. But and then of course Gloria Anzaldúa, whose quote I use as an epigraph. I was so deeply influenced by her book, especially Borderlands, where she moves between languages, and also I would say even between nonfiction practices, right, where she moves from writing something that is a political critique to then like writing something that's about the soul and about spiritual life. So she's a huge influence as well.
So thank you so much for being here with us today, Daisy. Listeners, her upcoming tour dates include New York City, Tucson, Sahuarita, Arizona, Portland, and San Antonio. If you're in the area, we encourage you to show up, and wherever you are, make sure you pick up a copy of Citizenship, Notes on an American Myth at an independent bookstore near you. Thank you so much, Daisy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure.